It's Adam Fleming in Strasbourg, joined tonight by...
Katya Adler in Brussels, missing you, Adam. And I don't get to be in a glamorous foyer, but in the BBC we get to shepherd in all sorts of very miserable-looking European diplomats onto the studios to talk about the state of affairs of Brexit tonight.
And Laura in Westminster wondering, really, really wondering, Adam, what your jumper is. Is it like the Mrs. Thatcher jumper from the 70s with all the European flags on it or not? I demand to know. I can't wait for the YouTube video.
Believe it or not, there is actually one of those jumpers in the Fleming household.
You see, I knew it.
Jumper I've got.
I knew it.
Yeah. I've realised though I'm actually dressed because I'm off duty. I'm in my chinos.
You're dressed.
I actually look
We're
like
glad you're dressed, Adam. Naked
I look like
Brexitcast
David
is for the
Lidding-
next season.
We've only just started, Katya.
yeah,
You're
that's
already gone there. Smut already. Blimey.
That's for the
I was
trade
gonna say that I look-
negotiations. Yeah.
I was going to say I look like David Liddington announcing he's not in it doing a coup on a
Producer
Sunday.
Dino's just showing me a picture. You are properly like W1A chinoed up. You are.
I want
You
to see the
are.
picture.
You
Right.
are. Look, I can see the picture now.
Okay, we have to keep talking about jumpers because nothing happened today, right?
No,
No
exactly.
politics, no news, no
No.
reason to have a Brexit cast.
Laura, take us through the sequence of events that will culminate or has culminated in Theresa May potentially not being Prime Minister anymore.
So for a long time, Brexitcasters know there has been a possibility in the background that the one thing that might possibly get this deal over the line is Theresa May basically sacrificing herself, throwing herself at the mercy of her party to say, back my deal and I will go and I will get out of your way, Boris Johnson / Dominic Raab / all the other people who want her job, who didn't want to back her deal. And that moment came to pass today after days and days of a lot of, and back-channeling, shall we say, a lot of conversations among Eurosceptics going forwards between them and Number 10. And she made the announcement at a packed room, Committee Room 14 in the House of Commons of her own MPs. Apparently it was so busy, some cabinet ministers had to suffer the indignity of waiting outside. And she told them that she would quit if they backed her deal. And what was interesting, actually, is almost immediately it seemed to have quite a significant impact. Boris Johnson came on board, Ian Duncan Smith came on board. There were a lot of what's known in the trade as switchers. Being a switcher suddenly became quite fashionable. So it did have an effect. But the question about her offering that huge price has always been, would it be enough?
Never.
Can we put a number on how many? Can we put a number on how many votes it might have won?
Well, remember there were
Was
about
actually difficult.
75 that she needed to get. The chat was maybe about 40 were ready to move, maybe even 50. But still with some holdouts, and it was always going to be dependent on what Theresa May's supposed allies in the Northern Irish DUP would do.
Exactly, because didn't Jacob Rees-Mogg say, yes, I'm switching over, dependent on the DUP? And
Yes.
the DUP then came out, whatever, an hour later and said, forget it, we're not going to vote in favour of this deal.
Yes. So, in short, without the DUP, this deal doesn't fly. And Tories who are holding out to wait and see, basically, if the DUP would sort of give them permission, if you like, to climb down. Because, of course, at the heart of the controversy over the deal is the backstop, which needs no reminder for most of our Brexitcasters. But if you're new, welcome. The backstop, of course, is the guarantee against the return of border checks in Northern Ireland. And for the DUP, that's always been completely unacceptable because it somehow separates out Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom. And the DUP, of course, have been absolutely intrinsic to this all along. And at about 9 o'clock, a statement emerged from Marlene Foster, filmed very beautifully, I think, in her living room over in Fern Manor, saying no. No. So, yeah. So
And
right
also-
now, you know, the Prime Minister's enormous gesture looks right now as if it won't be enough.
Two things that, I mean, one thing that struck me, just to, you note there I said two, so that you don't think I'm hogging. I'm telling you in advance it's two. One is it rang a bit hollow to me. I mean, you had, MPs who'd been in the room with Theresa May making the speech saying it was one of the best speeches she's ever given. There were tears in her eyes. It was very emotional. But like you said, this is not unexpected. This has kind of been. This is also a Prime Minister who's faced a vote of no confidence, and every Brexitcast we've questioned her political future. So that sort of rung a bit hollow. And I wonder if the fact that it's been around so long made it less of a big gesture in the end. And how low can you go? The fact that you do this, and it's still not good enough.
I think that even when big moves are discussed and anticipated, when they actually happen, it's still a huge moment. And it still had the impact very quickly on moving quite a lot of people. I think, though, and I also think you have to sometimes imagine what would have happened if she hadn't done. So MPs this afternoon were sort of saying things to me like, well, if she doesn't say she's going to go, there'll be complete fury. That whole kind of expectation management that Number 10 have got wrong quite a few times would have been even more disastrous. And she did move, a fair few people. But I think, as you suggest, it was never going to be a kind of cure-all. And Number 10 didn't think it would be a cure-all. And I'll just read you a text I had from a cabinet minister. Where is it in my phone that's about to blow up? It said, the two are linked. It's the right decision if it made a big enough difference. That was at about 8:30, about 20 minutes before Arlene Foster popped up. And it was really clear to me that senior members of the government did not know, as Theresa May was making that statement, partly they didn't know she was going to do it, actually. Her senior colleagues didn't know she was going to do it.
Really? Right.
Yeah, they didn't know. They didn't know when she did it whether or not it would buy off the DUP. I mean, again, that's a bit like not knowing if Geoffrey Cox was going to update his legal opinion, isn't it? And one senior Brexiteer was saying to me, I cannot believe they were so stupid as to make her do that or for her to decide to do that without knowing that the DUP were then going to come in line. Would you play your last card when you don't know what it was going to be?
Was her sort of resignation, because it feels wrong to call it a resignation because she's not really resigned yet, but or at all.
It was back me and I'll
was
go.
Her resignation ever designed to win over the DUP? Because they weren't the problems that had a problem with her. People that had a problem with their leadership. It was the Jacob Rees-Moggs and the Borises that did.
I think it was designed to unlock the stalemate. Okay, so for ages we've been talking about this sort of you firstery, I'll move, the DUP moves, and the DUP were saying, well, we'll move if it seems that the political wind is moving in that way. But you come back fundamentally to, was there anything sort of in the constitutional changes or the wrapping up of the deal in a different way that might have been acceptable for the DUP? I don't think, Adam, actually rightly, as you suggest, I don't think that alone was expected to move the DUP sort of as a single act, but as a way of creating political momentum, because, we've talked about it so often, hasn't we, throughout this whole process. It's not always about the precise policy issues that are on the table. It's about creating a sense of political energy or creating a kind of inevitability. But it looks very difficult tonight to see how it's going to change things in a very dramatic way, and it means that the DUP still hold the Prime Minister's future in their hands. And Arlene Foster is still in Northern Ireland, and unless and until she's on a plane in Belfast on her way over here, I can't see this deal getting through. That doesn't mean it never will, but I can't see it at the moment. But I just have to, just for fun.
Unless and until. What a great phrase.
And that's a very Whitehall phrase, isn't it?
Let's not go into the backstop at this particular moment. But also, what kind of resignation promise is it?
Do you know the truth of it? I don't think Number 10 knows. So I asked someone senior in Number 10, I said, what happens if the deal doesn't go through? And they said, that's a whole other ballgame. I don't think they know. But you can't take it back. You can't be Prime Minister and tell your party you're going to quit if they do this. You can't take that back. And
but how messy? I mean, I was asked this evening, does all of this resignation, non-resignation kind of who thought this through shenanigans make Theresa May look even weaker in EU eyes? And I just said, no, you couldn't look weaker in EU eyes.
Well,
like it just, it's they right at the beginning. I always say this, and I'm sorry I'm going to repeat it, but right at the beginning of this process, when we weren't sure who was going to replace David Cameron, we were asking people, sort of decision makers in the EU, do you prefer X? Do you prefer Y? Do you worry about a hard Brexit here? And the answer that came to me always was, at the end of the day, the EU wants to do an exit deal with the UK, but in order to do so, they need a prime minister who has enough of a majority in support that they can do a deal with us in Brussels, I was told, and sell it back home. And Theresa May has not managed to do that. She's always moved the goalposts, and this sort of indecision that has just marked the whole of the Brexit process culminated, tonight. And I know we're not supposed to talk about this yet, Adam. You've been I'm allowed to say Germanic because of my ancestry. And we're now mixing the two phases. I'm sorry, but I'm going to say, sorry, the indicative
Strict sequencing.
Exactly. I'm sorry, I've messed it up. But that's the UK side of me. I want to mix it all up. And again, it's sort of, indecisive, unclear.
But hang on. I mean, one thing again, we've talked about this so many times, and the EU's always said, we want someone to have be able to command a majority and have a solid, stable majority in the House of Commons. It's a minority government. It's a minority government. So whoever it is, it's a minority government at a time when the two main parties are further apart politically than they've been for eons and eons and eons and eons. So if they say, well, we only want to deal with somebody who has got a majority, and I know that's obviously a kind of oversimplification of what you said, like the reality is whoever was in charge since summer 2017, the fact is they're dealing with a minority government. And even if she quits, well, if she does go, they'll still be dealing with a minority government. Whoever's in charge. And it's been weird to me as well this week. Well, we've heard EU leaders again and again and again and again say, well, why don't they do a cross-party compromise? Why doesn't they look to a parliamentary compromise?
Yeah.
We've had this debate so many times. That's been politically impossible for Theresa May. But then when they said they did want to do that, the EU was then very quick to say, yes, but our interlocutor will still be Theresa May. So, talk about cake and eat it, right? It's been
no, that's what they meant was what they've hoped is, considering absolutely the realities of being at the head of a minority government, was that however partisan UK politics are, in a case of what is now a national crisis, they would hope that the Prime Minister, whether it is Theresa May or whoever, it's not her fault, but they don't say it's just Theresa May, but would reach across the aisle and say, I know this is not the way that things are normally done here, but this is an emergency. Let's get through this and we can go back to kind of booing and hissing and throwing bits of paper at each other across the aisle. And that hasn't happened.
No.
And I think that you're right. And every time I hear now an EU figure like Guy Verhofstadt of the European Parliament this week talking again about cross-party cooperation, I think of you, Laura, going, no, you don't understand politics in the UK.
It sounds nice, and I suppose that's on both sides, isn't it? As I think we've probably all learned this on both sides. There has been so much wishful thinking by politicians on all, whether it's EU politicians or British politicians, UK politicians, whoever. There's been so much wishful thinking because it's easier to talk about things that you might like rather than actually confronting the cold reality of the times that we're in, maybe in terms of the quality of the leadership on all sides.
Because one of the things that the EU side did like about Theresa May was her respect for the process, for the structures that were built around the process, the sequencing, the parameters, and just how it worked. And so there's a now infamous anecdote of a conversation between Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker in Sharm el-Sheikh, where the deal was not done in the desert, where Theresa May said, Jean-Claude, how can you reassure me that when you retire at the end of this year, you're not replaced by a baddie like Matteo Salvini of Italy, somebody who just wants to rip everything up and doesn't respect the rules? And Juncker now infamously said to her, well, how can you guarantee me that you won't be replaced by somebody like Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Or Dominic Raab, who might want to scrap the deal and start again, right?
Exactly. And so that's the one thing they really did like about Theresa May, that they thought she was reliable when it came to respecting the process.
But can I just say on this point, as we kind of delve into the dunes, is that this fear, worry, concern, or awareness of the reality that Theresa May could be replaced at any time by any of these different figures, is why the EU has tried to tie down the UK as much as possible with this withdrawal agreement, because there is no trust.
Which is why there will always be a backstop.
which is why there will always be a backstop. And this is something I find myself screaming, literally scream. My kids think I've gone really stark raving mad now, screaming at the radio in the car, in the kitchen, in the bath, everywhere. When there are politicians in the UK who are interviewed and talk about the backstop, or talk about let's go to no deal, or let's do this, let's do that, and move on to trade relations or Malthouse, whatever, the backstop will come back to haunt at every single stage. It won't be called the back; it'll be called something else. But this issue is not going away because of our geography and because of the history of the Troubles. It is not. It's never going to go away, and it is always going to come back. Which is also why, the EU, and yes, of course, it can always be seen as simplistic. I appreciate that, but sort of bangs its head against the wall sometimes, saying, look, if you want to leave the EU, just sign off on the withdrawal. Let's get through to the other side, because we can start talking about trade, and we can start talking about the future, and we can start trying to build something out of this, because the backstop is never going away and will always come back.
Which is, of course, what
the UK has to realise that.
Which is one of the really interesting things in the last few weeks. I mean, I know, Katia, you said lots, they're on the same side in lots of ways, which I suppose for the first half of this process, it seemed that Theresa May and the EU were really, really pitted against each other. And then actually, once the deal was done, flawed though it may well be to lots of critics on all sorts of sides, actually they've been on the same side in terms of trying to get it done. Shall we segue? Although, actually, before we do...
What about Donald Tusk?
When you mentioned Sharm el-Sheikh, I think I forgot to tell everybody that during that summit, you know what summits are like? They're like a big security lockdown. There were all these people driving around this kind of slightly odd conference centre in Sharm el-Sheikh. Lovely though it was a slightly surreal experience, and it was about 1 million degrees outside. Anyway, there were all these guys driving around on golf carts inside to get the leaders from one bit of the conference centre to another. God forbid they would have had to walk more than 100 yards. Anyway, one of them offered me and my producer a lift, and they drove us almost into the summit room where the leaders were sitting, trying to work it all out. And we clearly didn't have the right pass at all, but he said, oh, you want to go this way? And we just got on to see, well, where will we end up? So we went on a big ride and nearly ended up in the room with world leaders, which would have been
could have been worse. It could have been like Austin Powers, you got stuck in the corridor.
Well, imagine if we'd ended up in the room. It would have been awful. I'd have been there playing Come On Eileen and all sorts of things, trying to be helpful. Also reminds me, on that same trip, one of the Prime Minister's security diplomatic protection squad, I bumped into him on the way to breakfast very early in the morning in Sharm el-Sheikh, and he said that they all listen to Brexitcast. So if you're listening now, Prime Minister's diplomatic protection squad, thank you
Hopefully
for
listening on one of those cool earpieces with a curly wire.
Exactly, and I'm wondering if they would have a favourite about who they'd like to protect next time.
Night.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
like, oh, sorry, eagle on the move. Oh, hang on, Katia's talking about something. Katia's telling filthy jokes. Oh, sorry, need to be on the protection lookout. Anyway, sorry.
What
I'm
would
now
you two
properly
want
rambling.
as your bodyguard code names?
Ooh, I don't know.
Well, I can be eagle because Adler means eagle in German.
Yeah.
Which is, Cara, the wonderful producer, says unicorn. Should be unicorn. I like that.
I don't know.
Actually,
Actually, on a postcard.
Maybe Brexitcasters could suggest good Secret
Yes,
Service code names for you.
please do.
Yeah, Donald Tusk was here in Strasbourg. He was doing his update from the European Council, which of course had a big Brexit bit. And this was the most dramatic sounding bit of the Brexit bit.
Here, let me make one personal remark to the members of this Parliament. Before the European Council, I said that we should be open to a long extension if the UK wishes to rethink its Brexit strategy, which would of course mean the UK's participation in the European Parliament elections. And then there were voices saying that this would be harmful or inconvenient to some of you. Let me be clear, such thinking is unacceptable. You cannot betray the 6 million people who signed the petition to revoke Article 50, the 1 million people who marched for a people's vote, or the increasing majority of people who want to remain in the European Union. They may feel that they are not sufficiently represented by the UK Parliament, but they must feel that they are represented by you in this chamber, because they are Europeans. Thank you.
So it was dramatic sounding, but it's also been widely and wildly kind of misinterpreted, I feel, throughout the day.
Because
Well, first of all, he said it in a slightly weird way because he was directing it directly at MEPs in the chamber, and it was him saying to them, shut up about being worried about UK MEPs staying in this place in a long Brexit extension and causing a fuss, because if the UK was still in and they still had MEPs, then the citizens of the UK were entitled to be represented in the European Parliament. So that's what he was directly saying, and it was a bit sort of weird. But obviously the indirect message was aimed at Remain voters and second referendumers in the UK.
But it was a message, I think, and we know Donald Tusk, and we know how much he's always wanted the UK to change its mind. He's been right out there in front of it. But I think today's message was essentially one of sympathy and solidarity rather than realistic longing. And I think the way that the remarks are taken out of context is that I still feel, well, definitely the questions that I get asked on different programs or just sort of random people, and is that the EU is just desperately still hoping that we're all going to change our mind and that the UK is going to stay in, as if that were the main focus. And this is not the main focus. You know, the referendum was held almost 3 years ago now. The EU has got used to the idea of Brexit. They are frustrated and concerned about ongoing uncertainty. Donald Tusk talked again about the idea of being open to having a longer extension, which would lead to the UK holding parliamentary elections and more UK MEPs and so on. But he wasn't pushing the UK to have it. Nobody wants a longer extension. Nobody wants this agony to continue in the EU. And EU leaders' main focus now is not on the UK. It's about protecting themselves in the Brexit process. You know, they are convinced that Brexit is damaging, whether we do end up with an accidental no deal or Brexit itself. They think it's going to be damaging to the UK, at least in the short to medium term. Their priority now is to protect themselves from that damage, from the damage spreading, and they often use this word, it makes me twitch when they say it, but infecting, the whole of the European Union. So we really have moved much more now into damage control rather than longing for the UK to return to the fold as we had at the beginning.
But Katja, do you think Donald Tusk has given up on any hope of a long extension? Because he was the one pushing the longest extension when it was all being discussed sort of the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, a bit. Yes. Look, I think Donald Tusk will always hold out a candle for, the idea of a return. But I'd say realistically, he can see that it's not. I'm sorry obviously there are millions who have signed up to the idea of cancelling Brexit, and many people, and we'll talk about the indicative votes in a minute, sorry, Adam, the idea of holding a second referendum. But in general in the EU, it is not seen as a likely outcome right now. And for many, they worry about the realities of what it would be like to have the UK back in the fold after all this, which is not to say they would say no. But my main point is not that they wouldn't want it. That's not their main focus anymore, and they're less obsessed with us than with what the effect of what we're doing is on them. That's the shift in focus.
Right, let's shift in focus to the votes. Although with the Donald Tusk, I was interested, and it was slightly naughty of him to say 1 million people went on the People's Vote March, because they didn't, according to estimates by people who know about this stuff. As ever with these things, the protesters estimated gazillions, 1 million, and that was a hugely impressive turnout. I'm not knocking it for a second, but it was interesting to me that Donald Tusk repeated that figure of 1 million like it's something that is established fact, when it's not. And some eager beaver fact checkers have checked it out, and actually the numbers look like sort of 300,000 or 400,000. So anyway, it's a slightly side point, but it was interesting to me in this era when a lot of people worry about politicians circulating things that aren't necessarily completely accurate.
Well, while we've been on air, there's been a poll online about what this episode should be called. The winner is Jonathan Spink, who says it should be called Indicative Nopes.
Oh, I see what you did there, Jonathan. Well done.
Right, thank you, you two, and thank you, everyone who's been looking at us with their eyes rather than just listening with their ears.
It sounds really weird.
It does look really
I know. I really regretted saying that as soon as I said it.
Enough.
Never enough.
I'm taking my headphones off.
Never,
Bye.
never. Bye.